Greetings aspirants, welcome to Narayana IAS. This is Ananta Krishna, and in this special session, we will be dealing with the recently signed what is referred to as India EFTA Free Trade Agreement. Before analyzing this particular topic, I have one request for you all. If you like this initiative, please do like, share and comment on the video, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel Narayana IAS. One-stop destination for all of your UPSC examination requirements. Please keep in mind that these videos are going to be very helpful for you both for the preliminary examination and main examination, and as we clearly see that these are on the dot for your UPSC examination requirements, they are going to simplify all of your efforts towards the goal. We shall look into the analysis of what is referred to as India EFTA Free Trade Agreement. Before getting into this particular topic, we shall look at the aspects of this free trade agreement in such a way that it is helpful for you, particularly for GS paper 3 point of view. As we clearly see that this is important from what is referred to as issues relating to planning and mobilization of resources, and also issues relating to growth, development and employment. And as you see the details of these particular free trade agreement, all these aspects have been clearly catered to, and hence under all these aspects this particular agreement is important. And if you want to clearly know the importance of this analysis that we are doing, please take a look at these two previous year questions. The first question is from the preliminary examination in 2017. Clearly it is referring to the free trade negotiations that were happening with EU, and there were few concerns because of which we were having this as a question. As you see here, broad-based trade and investment agreement is sometimes seen in the news in the context of negotiations held between India and, as you clearly see, it was actually between India and European Union. As this so-called European Free Trade Area constitute a component of the European Union, this also becomes important for your preliminary examination. Second, if you look at this particular mains question, the broader aims and objectives of WTO are to manage and promote international trade in the era of globalization. But the Doha round of negotiations seem doomed due to differences between the developed and the developing countries discussed in the Indian perspective, asked in 2016. As we clearly see with respect to this particular agreement, it is one such strategic shift that is happening in this so-called era of deglobalization, whereby since Doha round, we are again starting to see a kind of ray of hope in the phenomenon of possibility of multilateralism and globalization. We shall look into the details now. What is the context? As I was clearly mentioning, this India EFTA Free Trade Agreement, as you clearly see, is a strategic shift. Now, what do we mean by this in terms of context? The first thing that you have to keep in mind is that we have what is called as Marrakesh Agreement, where this was the basis for the establishment of WTO. And if you analyze the historical evolution of globalization as a phenomenon across the globe, this Marrakesh Agreement, which has led to the setting up of WTO, is seen as the beginning of hyper phase of globalization in the world, whereby for the next quarter century, you would see that trade has taken over the developmental efforts across the globe. Number one. Number two, within this particular evolution of hyper phase of globalization, you have one particular phase wherein under WTO there will be conferences, and amongst these conferences, as we have already seen, Doha round appears to have gained lot of prominence. Why? As you clearly see that this Doha round was not only catering to reducing tariffs and restrictions across various sectors of any particular economy, be it agriculture, be it industry, be it services, but it was also looking into expanding the trade, particularly from the perspective of least developed countries and developing countries. And more importantly, this Doha round focused upon trade from the perspective of these least developed countries and developing countries. Since this Doha round, as we come to this phase of near end of globalization, this particular free trade agreement is again seen as a ray of hope from the perspective of developing countries. This is the first important thing that you have to keep in mind, which is why this is being referred to as strategic shift. Second, apart from this, if you look at this from the perspective of India, I repeat, if you look at this from the perspective of India, on the one hand, you would see that this so-called deglobalization has taken over. It is being seen as a situation wherein globalization and its hyperphase has clearly ended. What we are seeing is, amidst such global situation, where on the one hand geopolitical tensions are marring any possibility of free trade, on the other hand, as you see, protectionist measures are increasing day by day across the globe. This is again another strategic shift for the Indian side and from the Indian perspective, as you clearly see happening. Third, if you look at this from the EU's perspective, as you refer to this European free trade area, as you observe, this European free trade area is being seen as a separation from the entire European Union, because they also act on behalf of themselves in certain policy matters. This is one such particular matter. On the one hand, if this is the kind of opinion that European Union has with respect to this European free trade area, what you see is, on the other hand, this is showing a way for the entire European Union as to how to negotiate a free trade agreement when there are many sensitive points over which the disagreements are persisting, particularly with respect to the free trade agreement that they are negotiating with India. This is the third aspect that we have to keep in mind, because of which this is being seen as a strategic shift. Fourth, very importantly, unknowingly or knowingly, this agreement in fact brings into forth one of the very strategic locations in the world, which is being subjected to lot of geopolitical tension, but which has not been seen in the news more often. That particular region is this region of Svalbard. If you look at this particular map, as you clearly see, just above the Norway, in this part of the region, you have a region which is referred to as Svalbard. With respect to this particular region, this free trade agreement is not applicable except for trade in goods. This clearly shows you the sensitivity of this particular region. On the one hand, this is part of Norway and this is autonomously existing within the sovereignty of Norway, but on the other hand, even though Norway is part of EFTA and EFTA has signed this free trade agreement, and this free trade agreement hence has to be applicable to the entire area covered under EFTA, we clearly see that this part of the region is left out of it. And keep in mind that this part of the region has already been subjected to a lot of geopolitical tension between NATO forces and even the Russia. This another aspect that this particular free trade agreement brings out. If you now look at what this European free trade area is, clearly it is including this government of Iceland or sovereign region of Iceland. Second, it also includes this kingdom of Norway. Third, it also includes the Confederation of Switzerland. And fourth, it also includes this Principality of Liechtenstein, which is one of the principalities of Switzerland, since they have signed a customs union amongst the two. And this particular European free trade area, as we know, has come into being in 1923. Since then, this has remained, and it is this which is now leading the way towards multilateralism and revival of globalization across the globe. As you now see and understand this EFTA, we shall now look into the details. This particular free trade agreement is having significance on number of aspects. What are those? Number one, it allows what is referred to as trade in goods. Now, if I say that the trade in goods is allowed, how will I decide that a particular good can be subjected to trade, and in this particular trade it is being accepted across the regions, whoever are parties to this particular trade agreement? They say that International Convention on the Harmonized Commodity Description and Coding System, which has been adopted for such trading purposes, has been accepted as the standard in order to allow the trade in goods, as you see in this part of the agreement. Number one. Number two, what you also see is that this preferential tariff treatment which is provided in this must satisfy what is referred to as rules of origin. Whenever a free trade agreement has been signed under the aegis of WTO norms and conditions, there are two things which are possible in this free trade. One, the preferential trade and the non-preferential trade. Whenever you are saying that there is preferential trade, by which it means that there are two sovereign entities which have become parties to a particular free trade agreement. And as they have become parties to free trade agreement, they will have what is referred to as preferential tariff treatment, which is not applicable to the sovereign entities which are not parties to this particular agreement. The preferential tariff treatment is possible only when you can establish that that particular good has its origin from the sovereign entity which is party to this particular agreement. This is what this rules of origin in fact indicates. On the other hand, if you are having the trade which is part of what is referred to as rules of non-preferential treatment, then it would generally be made possible for all those other sovereign entities with whom they will have this what is referred to as most favored nation status as part of the so-called GATT, General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, which is signed under the aegis of World Trade Organization. Third, as you see this particular agreement, clearly it says that it is sensitive to the subsidies and also production linked incentives, which is a positive thing that we have with respect to India or from the perspective of India, whereby it says that the government procurement as a separate chapter which has been included, even though the smallest chapter in the entire agreement, it is clearly sensitive to these requirements of government procurement given certain legal mandates that the Indian government has, particularly with regard to the eradication of poverty. This particular agreement is sensitive to this. This shows the negotiating ability of Indian government. Number two, as he clearly said, this is also sensitive to this production linked incentive scheme, which is providing certain incentives to all those firms and sectors which are part of those 14 sectors to which this PLI scheme is applicable, by which it means that this is not subjected to this definition of the subsidies which are providing preferential treatment to some of the domestic companies. Rather, it is being now accepted as a required condition for having economic development in India, by which again it means that this PLI scheme being designed in such a way that it is a market driven scheme. It is not a scheme wherein government is directly pumping in the subsidized amount towards a particular industry or firm. Market driven scheme, by which it means that unless and until you show the profit, whereby as part of competition you are able to perform well, you cannot claim or avail the subsidized amount under this particular production linked incentive scheme. By the name itself, you can clearly realize that, you can clearly identify that it is linked to the level of production that you are achieving. And hence, as this is a market driven scheme, it was easy for EFTA to accept this as one of the conditions that can be accepted as part of free trade agreement. Fourth, as you move ahead, as they have accepted both of these, trade facilitation, whereby both trade in goods and also subjecting this to the government procurement and the PLI scheme which has been accepted as part of this, must be now facilitated, for which they have come up with this mechanism called Subcommittee on Trade in Goods. It is this one issue which is being seen as a irritant when you see the trade negotiations between India and EU. Fourth, as you clearly see, it is also sensitive to the sanitary and phytosanitary measures which are part of the WTO agreements. The sanitary and phytosanitary measures, as you clearly know, caters to the plant health, human health and animal health. and this should not be disturbed because of whatever the additives or toxins or whichever of the similar kind which are used in the manufacturing or development of the goods which are now being traded, and this particular trade must not lead to any disturbance, to any deterioration to the plant health, animal health and the human health that we were mentioning. So we are now catering to this agreement which has been signed under WTO, by which again you are able to reach an agreement on something which is remaining as an irritant between India-EU free trade agreement. This is showing the way it is. In this sense, this is again another strategic shift that you are seeing. And in order to make sure that this is being implemented, you have a subcommittee on sanitary and phytosanitary measures which will be looking into it in detailed manner. And as you see all these, there can be possibility of technical barriers to trade, by which it means that whenever I am trading in goods, there has to be standardization, and the standardization in goods will be defined in terms of certain technical parameters, and these should not become barriers to trade, by which it means that right from the union government to the local governments, both in the European free trade area and also in Indian territory, you should see that these governments are implementing those standardized practices whatever have been accepted as part of WTO, GATT and GATS agreements, and for which they have another subcommittee on this technical barriers to trade to oversee it and implement it. On the other hand, you also have this trade in services has been accepted, and whatever that have been included as services under the definition of services under this Treaty of General Agreement on Trade in Services under the aegis of WTO, all those are included here. Apart from them, you have financial services and telecommunications are also a part of this trade in services, and wherever those other services are there, they can be subjected to free trade in services by granting what is referred to as most favored nation status. Moreover, this is also having a place for what is referred to as investment promotion and cooperation. This is something very, very significant. This is what in fact government was mentioning when it was announcing this particular free trade agreement to the media. One, the $50 billion within 10 years from the entry into force of this particular agreement after its ratification in the respective governments will be pumped in as investment, as foreign direct investment into Indian territory, Indian economy. This is first thing. Second thing, another additional $50 billion in the succeeding 5 years will also be pumped in. Now, what is the basis for this? The basis for this is that the India EFTA free trade agreement has recognized that for last 2 decades, India has witnessed a nominal GDP growth rate of 9.5% in dollar terms. I repeat, in dollar terms. And as they have seen that consistently India is able to register this growth rate of or nominal GDP growth rate of 9.5%, the EFTA has given a leverage to sustenance and promotion of this growth rate for the next few decades. It is here it wants to have a proactive role for their own investors. Hence, it has decided that $100 billion of investment in the next 15 years in these 2 tranches will happen. Apart from this, this investment must also lead to generation of 1 million jobs. Job here is a regular employment, a formal employment that has been created with the utility of these investments alone. And this will also have a collaboration which is technological in nature, which is what we are also aiming at, given the fact that we are moving towards this another phase of revolution, technological revolution, and at the same time we are not forgetting the fact that this must promote MSMEs in India, which are catering to more than 35% of employment in the formal sector in India. All these have been the highlights of this particular agreement. Moreover, as part of this investment promotion and cooperation, this agreement is also sensitive to certain sectors where we are looking for cooperation from 4 of these particular sovereign nations. 1, earth science; 2, STEM; 3, healthcare; 4, biotechnology; digital technology, renewable energy, clean technology, and sustainable metal making. All these are the areas where we need their expertise, and we clearly see that this arrival of technology will push us further towards increasing the production and productivity by keeping ourselves sensitive to not only the environment and commitments we have towards protection of the environment, but also towards social justice. As you clearly see, this is also catering to the requirement of protection of intellectual property rights. So it says we will have adequate, effective, and non-discriminatory protection of intellectual property rights. Again, even though this chapter is small in this agreement, there is clear adherence to this IPR requirements under what is referred to as Trade in Intellectual Property Rights Agreement, as it has been signed under the aegis of WTO. Moreover, most important aspect of this agreement is being hailed as sustainable development. If you look at the history of trade across the globe, trade has been seen as a means to replace war in the world in earlier scenario during the phase of industrial revolution. But as you move ahead now, as we have moved into extreme levels of technological penetration and innovation, this now has to restore what is referred to as sustainability of the planet itself. So rather than now calling it as a replacement for war, which has been now seen as no more a reality, now trade is being seen as a promotion for what is referred to as sustainable development. In sustainable development, as we have defined under this UN Sustainable Development Goals 2030, there are three fundamental components: economic development, social development, and environmental protection. This agreement is clearly sensitive and accepting those norms and conditions which have been accepted on the international fora, and the conventions to which India and EFTA are party to. These have been accepted as the framework under which this particular free trade agreement functions. That is, 1. Rio Declaration on Environment and Development and the Agenda 21 that has been signed in 1992, and then Johannesburg Declaration on Sustainable Development and its plan for implementation as part of economic development. Second, as part of social development, we have accepted certain norms which have been signed under the aegis of International Labour Organization. Hence, this Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work, signed in 1998 under the aegis of ILO, which is catering to this social development, and it has been recognized that unless this happens, sustainable development through economic development and environmental protection is not possible. So this is being seen as a prerequisite for this requirement of sustainable development. Then you have Ministerial Declaration on Generating Full and Productive Employment and Decent Work for All and its impact on sustainable development as another framework. Then ILO Declaration on Social Justice for a fair globalization, by which we are accepting that globalization did not lead to the much required goal of social justice. Unless this happens, sustainable development in terms of future generation in comparison with the present generation is not possible, wherein these fruits of development must also cater to the future generation and their requirements. Third, as part of this sustainable development, the most important component is environmental protection. Clearly, the outcome document of UN Conference on Sustainable Development of 2012, titled The Future We Want, which is part of this Rio Plus 20 agreement or conference, is one framework which is being adhered to as part of this free trade agreement. Then we are also adhering to this UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, under which you clearly have, for example, this goal 17, which is calling for mobilization of domestic resources in order to make sure that sustainable development is possible. And if you keep on seeing the sub-goals within this 17th goal of mobilization of resources for sustainable development, you would see two fundamental components. One, the developed nations have this obligation that they must promote trade in such a way that this preferential trade in favor of developing countries and developed countries must happen. This is clearly in tune with that particular requirement. Second, there is second component in which it says that whatever the tariffs you have must be streamlined in such a way that this free trade in favor of developing countries and least developed countries is promoted. As these two are promoted, this will lead to what is referred to as environmental protection, because as this is being done, you clearly promote the cleaner technologies as we were seeing in the agreement, and the sectoral preferences that we have towards which these investments would be coming, and this would hence promote cleaner technologies and cleaner energies which are required for the development, which are the prerequisite for the development, and hence economic development is occurring when social development and environmental protection are also being catered to. It is in this sense this is being seen as a new era in the so-called globalization and so-called free trade across the globe. Moving ahead, we also have this mechanism of dispute resolution, wherein it says that initially we have to make sure that such disputes are avoided, and even when they arise, this is being settled using whatever the joint mechanism that they have set up in order to settle such disputes. As we clearly know that every agreement, including such free trade agreements, cater to two fundamental things. One, what are my rights? And two, what are my obligations? It is these which might be catering to certain clarifications and certain requirements in terms of doubts and ambiguities, and hence all of these would be subjected to this joint mechanism that has been set up, and which would be making sure that the disputes are initially avoided and within a time-bound manner they are also settled. Moreover, you also have the institutional provision wherein this joint EFTA India committee would be set up, which would be overseeing the major functionalities of this particular agreement. And moreover, there is one particular clause in this agreement which is again favorable to India particularly. If suppose India is willing to withdraw from this particular agreement, then by choice as a sovereign entity, it can withdraw from it, and more importantly, the time at which it ratifies such withdrawal, that particular moment itself, India will be free from this particular free trade agreement. Now, if you see all of these components clearly, there are certain major achievements that we have and major components which in fact act as a lesson for future free trade negotiations, not just for India but also for any other party which is looking for promotion of free trade and multilateralism. One, there might be sensitive issues such as sanitary and phytosanitary measures, which has been an irritant between India and EU free trade, that can be addressed. Second, you might accept the requirements of investment and job creation as part of free trade negotiations. This can be pushed and this can be achieved. Third, when a developing nation and least developing country are negotiating any free trade agreement, they have to focus upon the requirements that are there as part of sustainable development. Fourth, the trade can be made as a means to promote sustainable development, whereby economic development, social development, while making sure that environmental protection is being taken care of, can be achieved. Now, if you look at another aspect which is possible at the macro level, we clearly know that since 2016, the world has entered into what is referred to as deglobalization phase, wherein if I were to have the globalization to continue, this would have shown a graph in the long term in this particular manner. However, as we have seen the reduction in the globalization since the Brexit times, either because of geopolitical tensions or because of supply chain disruptions that have happened, or because of certain political turmoil that we were seeing across the globe within certain sovereign entities, sovereign nations, the deglobalization is a reality. Within this phase of deglobalization, as I said, this is serving as a ray of hope for multilateralism. So, in international relations point of view too, economics can serve as the basis to improve the relations, is the lesson from this particular agreement. Moreover, we must also see this particular agreement in terms of what is referred to as importance of these free trade agreements for Indian economy. If you look at this so-called hyper phase of globalization since 1992, particularly with respect to India, this is true since 2010. You would see that the free trade has led to higher and higher growth rates for Indian economy. This dotted line is the one which showcases the free trade serving the Indian GDP growth rates. On the other hand, this solid line shows you the growth rate that was possible because of these particular goods or services which are not part of so-called free trade agreements, or the regions with which we do not have the free trade agreement did not see much of improvement in terms of bilateral trade. Once you realize this, then we will realize that such free trade agreements are going to be beneficial for India. Third aspect, we must also look at this free trade agreement in terms of what is referred to as trade diversification. This trade diversification can be seen in two respects. One, in terms of the trade destination, and two, in terms of basket of goods and services. If you look at this particular agreement, yes, it is true that with EFTA, as of now, we have a trade deficit to the tune of $14 billion. However, as you clearly see that there will be incoming investments happening, there will be promotion of job growth in India. This trade deficit is going to be beneficial for India rather than being negative for Indian economy, having an adverse effect upon the balance of payment situation. Second, as you clearly see that this is going to promote the arrival of cleaner technologies and critical technologies for the purpose of improving the production and productivity levels in the Indian manufacturing sector, particularly MSME, this is going to be beneficial. So, once this happens, it is our goods which will be flowing towards the particular EFTA as a trade bloc, and hence this will ultimately lead to the trade diversification in terms of destination. As of now, it is the Middle East and it is the USA and it is the African continent which are catering to more and more trade from India. Now, this particular region is being seen as another region receiving our exports. Hence, it will lead to trade diversification. Second, if you look at this from the perspective of basket of goods and services with respect to which the trade diversification has to happen, as you clearly see, this is not limited to just the agricultural products. This has been expanded to most of the goods and services, and if you clearly see, this is subjected to more than 95% of the tariff line over which the goods and services can be traded. Irrespective of this, India has allowed mere 85% tariff lines to which certain goods are subjected, and it is in these goods alone India has allowed trade with EFTA. It is even in this respect, India has retained its so-called protection that is required for the domestic sector. Even when it was opening up the dairy sector or the agriculture sector, which are sensitive to such free trade, we have still made sure that they are protected. It is in all these respects, this EFTA has shown a leeway for future multilateralism and future globalization that would be made possible. Now, if you look at what are those possible areas from which questions can be asked. One, this particular agreement is serving sustainable development, which can be asked in preliminary examination. Second, this particular agreement is subjected to certain restrictions when you are trading with respect to or with the region of Svalbard. This can be another question. Third, the nature of the polity that you see, either of Liechtenstein or of Norway, which is a kingdom, Liechtenstein, which is a principality, Switzerland, which is a confederation, even this can be a question. Fourth, this is also catering to investment to the tune of $100 billion. However, you have to remember that it is occurring in two tranches. All these are part and parcel of possible preliminary questions. On the other hand, this is also important for the main examination because, as you have clearly seen the PYQ, since Doha round, the developing countries and developed countries are at loggerheads, and in this phase of deglobalization, this is showing clearly a ray of hope for the future multilateralism that is possible, future trade in terms of free from tariffs and restrictions which is possible, and hence this one particular area can be asked for the main examination. With this, I will end this session. If you like this video, please do like, share and comment on the video, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel Narayana IAS, the one-stop destination for all of your UPSC Civil Service examination requirements. Thanks one and all.